They were supposed to be the most innocent members of society. Children, young, wide-eyed, curious. But every so often, the world is forced to confront a much darker reality. One where those same children are capable of the most brutal, premeditated violence. It's a truth that rattles the very core of our understanding of innocence. What happens when innocence turns to cruelty? When youthful faces hide violent intent? In today's story, we confront the unsettling question. What drives a child to kill? Not in self-defense. Not in a moment of emotional instability. But with premeditated malice. With strategy. With intent. These are the kinds of crimes that shake even the most experienced investigators. Because when the lines blur between victim and monster, between childhood and criminality, society is forced to re-examine everything it thought it knew about the human psyche. Most people believe children are born innocent, that evil is something learned, something absorbed through toxic environments, broken homes, or corrupt peer influence. But what if that's not always the case? What if, for some, the capacity for cruelty grows alongside their bones? What if under the surface of youthful smiles, there are fractured minds just waiting for the right moment to explode? You see, the stories we often tell involve hardened criminals, gang leaders, serial predators, people we can distance ourselves from. But when the same kind of darkness emerges in someone barely out of primary school, it's different. It's closer. It's haunting. Tonight, we're not just going to tell you about a murder. We're going to take you into the mind of a group of teenagers, some barely teenagers at all, who committed a crime so disturbing it shook an entire community. A group so young, their mugshots looked more like school yearbook photos than images you'd expect from a criminal case file. They didn't wear masks. They didn't plan a stealthy ambush in the dark. They acted in broad daylight, on a normal street, in a normal neighborhood, against a boy who didn't provoke them, a boy who wasn't in a gang, a boy whose only mistake was being in the wrong place, at the wrong time. This is not just a story about violence. This is about how innocence erodes, how society fails, how peer pressure, poverty, and lack of guidance can create monsters out of children. It's about a life cut short, a mother left shattered, a sister who will forever carry a wound that no justice can heal. Elijah Carter, just 19, an apprentice bricklayer, a dreamer, a protector, a son, a brother, a friend, gone in a matter of minutes, stabbed, left to bleed out in a grimy alleyway while his killers posted smug messages online, laughing at his final moments. So ask yourself, what does it take to get to that point? How did these kids grow up with such detachment from life, from empathy, from consequences? Was it the system? Was it the streets? Or was it something deeper? Something we don't yet understand? Welcome to Silent Crime Witness, where we tell the stories that others won't. The ones that stay with you long after the video ends. The ones that demand reflection, not just reaction. If you believe these stories need to be told, if you believe there's value in understanding what went wrong so we can prevent the next tragedy, then please take a second to support this channel. Hit that subscribe button. Click like if you want YouTube to push the story out to more people. And drop a comment below with your thoughts, your questions, your reflections. This is more than a video. It's a conversation. And every time you participate, you're helping to make sure that stories like Elijah's aren't forgotten. So settle in, because this story will take you through not just one life, but several. Through broken homes and blood-stained alleys. Through courtroom drama and emotional goodbyes. Through the minds of children who should have been playing video games but instead were planning how to kill. And most of all, through the haunting truth that sometimes evil wears a school uniform. Before his name echoed in courtrooms and newspaper headlines, Elijah Carter was just a boy. A boy with dreams, quirks, laughter, and love. To understand the tragedy that would later unfold, we have to first understand who he was before it all. Elijah was born on a rainy April morning in Crest Hill, a small working-class community nestled between aging brick buildings and fading playgrounds. He was the first child of Denise and Thomas Carter, a nurse's aide and a warehouse supervisor who worked long hours but loved even harder. From the moment he entered the world, Elijah was described as curious and observant. The kind of baby that stared deeply at faces, as if trying to understand the world before he could even speak. He grew up in a modest two-bedroom apartment on Maple Street, where life was never luxurious, but always warm. His mother decorated the walls with Elijah's crayon drawings and birthday photos, each one a small testament to their tight-knit bond. His younger sister, Maya, arrived when he was 5. From the beginning, Elijah took his role as big brother seriously, helping with feedings, reading bedtime stories, and holding her hand when she was scared of the dark. Family was everything to Elijah. Every Sunday, without fail, they'd gather around the small wooden dining table for a homemade dinner. Not always fancy, but always meaningful. Elijah would often help his mother in the kitchen, chopping vegetables and humming along to old soul records. His father, quiet but fiercely protective, taught him how to ride a bike and how to hold a conversation with respect. These were the foundations of who Elijah was. In school, Elijah stood out not for mischief or rebellion, but for kindness. His teachers described him as thoughtful, quick to offer help, and always polite. He wasn't the loudest or the most athletic, but he had a sharp mind and a heart to match. He loved reading mystery novels and drawing comic book characters in his notebooks. He'd talk for hours about one day becoming a graphic novelist, even naming his future characters and planning storylines in spiral-bound journals. But life in Crest Hill wasn't always gentle. The neighborhood had its share of challenges: rising crime, broken streetlights, and an education system stretched too thin. Elijah sometimes walked past older boys on street corners, watching silently as they exchanged things they shouldn't. He was aware of the undercurrent, the quiet pressure that simmered beneath the surface. But his family did everything they could to shield him from it. Evening curfews, after-school activities, constant check-ins. Still, cracks began to show. Around age 14, Elijah started withdrawing. His once vibrant drawings faded into rough sketches. He began spending more time alone, coming home quieter than usual. At first, his parents thought it was just adolescence, a phase, a storm that would pass. But behind that change were silent struggles, ones he didn't always know how to voice. There was a moment, one of those small, easy-to-miss moments, when his mother found a bruised notebook under his bed. Inside were pages filled with dark imagery, unsettling themes, and characters caught in endless battles. When she asked about it, Elijah just shrugged. "It's just a story, Mom," he said. But she could tell there was more. His best friend, Marcus, later shared that Elijah had started questioning a lot about the world. Why people hurt each other. Why some kids had to grow up faster than others. He wasn't angry, not outwardly, but he was disillusioned. He felt invisible, like his voice didn't matter. These weren't things easily discussed in classrooms or dinner tables. These were internal battles, slow-burning and quiet. But even through the storm, Elijah had his light. His laugh, soft and crooked, could still break through the silence. His care for Maya never faded. He still helped his mother carry groceries, still held the door for strangers. He was a good kid, a good soul trying to find his place in a complicated world. Crest Hill was a place of contrasts. Grand old buildings with cracked windows, playgrounds filled with laughter beside alleyways littered with needles. Crime rates were high, especially among youth. Drug trafficking, petty theft, and gang activity had become almost normalized. And beneath it all was the weight of poverty, a generational cycle that quietly stole futures before they even began. Parents like Denise tried to shield their children from the chaos, but it was everywhere. Schools underfunded, parks overrun, and jobs, if any, paid too little to matter. Most teenagers in Crest Hill didn't just grow up fast, they were forced to. And in this environment, the Ridgeway crew emerged. Not just a gang, but a presence, a looming force in the neighborhood. Their reputation was built not just on violence, but on influence. They knew who to recruit, how to lure kids in with the illusion of brotherhood, respect, and protection. The Ridgeway crew wasn't the most organized gang in the city, but they were the most visible. They stood at corners like street sentinels, their jackets marked with spray-painted symbols. They offered what Crest Hill couldn't: power, identity, and a sense of control. And to kids trying to find their place, that kind of promise was dangerously tempting. It wasn't always about money or drugs. It was about not being invisible. About being seen, being respected, even feared. And for many young boys in Crest Hill, that was the only currency they thought they had. At the center of the Ridgeway crew was Kareem Wallace, 18, charismatic, calculating, and carrying wounds so deep they'd calcified into a kind of personal armor. Abandoned by his father before birth, raised by a mother battling both addiction and depression, Kareem learned early that vulnerability was weakness, and weakness got you hurt. By 15, Kareem had a juvenile record: petty theft, vandalism, simple assault. Minor charges individually, but forming a pattern that social workers noted with increasing concern. What no one seemed to notice was how Kareem was building something. Not just a reputation, but a structure. A hierarchy with himself at the top, surrounded by boys even younger and more impressionable than he was. Trey Dixon was 14, small for his age with a perpetual nervous energy. His home life was a revolving door of his mother's boyfriends, some who ignored him, others who used him as a punching bag. In Kareem, he found something resembling stability, harsh as it was. Malik Grant, 15, was the muscle, already 6 feet tall with a hair-trigger temper that had gotten him expelled from 2 schools. Diagnosed with intermittent explosive disorder that went largely untreated, Malik found in the Ridgeway crew a place where his rage wasn't a liability but an asset. Dwayne Turner, 16, was the strategist, quiet, observant, with a mathematical mind that could have excelled in better circumstances. Instead, he applied his intelligence to planning territory expansions and calculating risks versus rewards. Jaden Cole, barely 13, was the newest recruit, eager to prove himself, desperate for approval, and too young to fully understand the consequences of the path he was choosing. His grandmother, his primary caregiver, worked night shifts. The hours between school ending and her return were a dangerous vacuum that Kareem filled with brutal efficiency. Together, they formed a unit bound not by genuine brotherhood, but by shared trauma, mutual need, and the intoxicating feeling of power in lives otherwise defined by powerlessness. Their activities began: small shoplifting, vandalism, selling loose cigarettes, and small amounts of marijuana. But as their confidence grew, so did their ambition and brutality. By the time Elijah Carter crossed their path, they had established a reputation that made even older gang members wary. This wasn't about territory in the traditional sense. The Ridgeway crew didn't control blocks for drug sales or protection rackets. What they controlled was fear, the perception that they were unpredictable, unbound by the usual rules, capable of violence disproportionate to any provocation. They weren't playing by any code older gangs would recognize, explained Detective James Morrison, who had tracked the crew for months before Elijah's murder. Traditional gangs, there's a logic to their violence. It's business, it's retaliation, it's specific. These kids, they'd hurt someone just to show they could. Just to feel something. That's a different kind of dangerous. The streets took notice. Other teenagers crossed to opposite sidewalks when they saw the crew coming. Store owners suddenly closed early if they entered. Even police patrol officers approached them with caution bordering on avoidance. This deference, this fear, it fed something in them, particularly in Kareem, who had spent his life being overlooked, underestimated, and dismissed. Crest Hill created the conditions. Neglect provided the opportunity. And 5 boys with nothing to lose formed something that would eventually take everything from Elijah Carter. It was a regular Tuesday. The sky was overcast. The streets were damp from rain the night before, and Elijah had no idea his life would end before the sun went down. He had a laundry bag slung over his shoulder as he walked down Maple Street with his best friend, Marcus Green. They were headed to Royal Wash, the neighborhood laundromat. The plan was simple: wash a few loads, hang around, maybe grab a bite at Dre's Grill across the street. Inside the laundromat, things were quiet. A few machines hummed, a mother struggled with a cranky toddler, and an elderly man sat reading a newspaper. Elijah dropped the bag, loaded the washer, fed in quarters. It was mundane, normal, ordinary, but outside something else was brewing. The Ridgeway crew had been lingering nearby, not doing much, just watching, smoking, throwing looks. Among them was Kareem, the unofficial leader of the crew. Beside him were the others, faces too young for the violence they'd seen, yet already hardened by it. As Elijah and Marcus stepped outside for fresh air while the washer ran, the first confrontation began. Started with words, snide remarks, mocking laughter. Marcus told Elijah to ignore them, but Elijah, for once, didn't look away. It wasn't that Elijah wanted trouble, but sometimes, all it takes is eye contact. A glance too long, a gesture misinterpreted. And in Crest Hill, a stare could be an act of war. "You think you're better than us?" Kareem said, stepping closer. Marcus stepped between them, trying to defuse the situation. But the Ridgeway crew didn't want peace. They wanted pride. They wanted dominance. And for reasons no one would ever truly understand, maybe old grudges, maybe nothing at all, they decided Elijah had to be made an example. What happened next unfolded with terrifying speed. The crew entered the laundromat, positioning themselves near exits. Security footage shows them spreading out, calculating, hunting. Elijah noticed them immediately. His body language changed, shoulders tightening, eyes constantly moving, assessing. He whispered something to Marcus, who nodded and carefully moved toward the counter, likely to ask the owner to call police. But there wasn't time. Trey deliberately spilled liquid soap across the floor by the back exit, a premeditated action to prevent escape. This single detail would later be cited by prosecutors as evidence of intent, of planning, of cold calculation beyond typical teenage impulse. When Elijah tried to leave, Jaden, the youngest, blocked his path. When he turned to find another exit, Malik was there. It was coordinated, practiced, a hunting formation they'd used before. The first punch came from Dwayne, striking Elijah from behind, sending him stumbling forward onto the soap-slick floor. He fell hard, then scrambled to his feet as the crew closed in. Marcus tried to intervene but was immediately overwhelmed. The elderly woman screamed. The young mother grabbed her child and ran. The owner reached for the phone. For a moment it seemed like a routine, if brutal, beating might be the extent of it. But then Kareem reached into his jacket and removed what investigators would later identify as a cane sword, a blade concealed within what appeared to be an ordinary walking stick. The security footage shows a brief pause, a moment when everything could have ended differently. Elijah was already bleeding from his lip, already outnumbered 5-1. There was no need for escalation, but something in Kareem's expression changed. A decision was made. The blade entered Elijah's thigh at 2:53 p.m., severing his femoral artery. The wound itself wasn't particularly deep, but it didn't need to be. The location was catastrophic. Blood pulsed onto the laundromat floor in rhythmic spurts, bright arterial blood that medical experts would later testify indicated an injury that would be fatal without immediate intervention. The crew didn't flee immediately. Security footage shows them watching for approximately 20 seconds as Elijah collapsed, as his life began draining away. Witness statements describe laughter. One patron reported hearing Kareem say, "That's how it's done," before they finally left. Not running, but walking unhurriedly, as if leaving a store or restaurant. Marcus rushed to Elijah, using his own shirt as a makeshift tourniquet. The owner was already on the phone with emergency services, his voice breaking as he described the scene. The elderly woman knelt beside them, praying audibly. Paramedics arrived 6 minutes later. 6 minutes in which Elijah remained conscious, in which he asked Marcus to tell his mother and sister he loved them, in which he struggled to breathe as shock set in. The ambulance departed at 3:12 p.m. Despite transfusions and emergency surgery, Elijah Carter was pronounced dead at 4:37 p.m. The cause? Exsanguination due to traumatic injury to the femoral artery. Approximately 74 minutes separated the mundane task of doing laundry from the end of a life full of promise. And during those same 74 minutes, the Ridgeway crew stopped for snacks at a corner store 3 blocks away, their demeanor described by the clerk as completely normal, like nothing happened. By evening, the first social media posts appeared. Vague references, inside jokes, emoji combinations that seemed innocuous to most but carried clear meaning to those who knew. One post, later recovered from Jaden's phone, simply read, "Problem solved today. Permanent solutions only." He added a laughing emoji. He was 13 years old. News travels fast in Crest Hill. Even before official notifications, even before detectives arrived at the Carter apartment, neighbors were already gathering, already whispering the terrible truth in hushed tones. Denise Carter had just woken for her evening shift when the knock came. 2 detectives, their faces bearing the particular strain of those about to shatter a family. Later, she wouldn't remember falling to her knees, wouldn't remember screaming, wouldn't remember Maya running from her bedroom, confusion giving way to horrified understanding. "There's been mistaken identity," Denise insisted, even as the detectives gently explained that Marcus had identified the body, that Elijah's ID had been in his pocket, that there was no mistake to cling to, no error to hope for. Thomas Carter was called from work. He arrived 30 minutes later, still wearing his warehouse uniform, disbelief hardening into a rage so profound it rendered him silent. Across town, emergency notification protocols were activated at Crest Hill High School. Counselors were called in for the following day. Scripts were prepared for teachers. Infrastructure for managing community trauma clicked efficiently into place, a system tragically well-practiced in responding to violence. Meanwhile, the investigation moved with unexpected speed. Unlike many cases in underserved communities, where witnesses often fear retaliation more than they trust justice, this time people came forward immediately. The elderly woman from the laundromat, the young mother, the owner, even people from neighboring businesses who had seen the crew enter or exit. More significantly, there was extensive security footage, not just from the laundromat, but from surrounding businesses, traffic cameras, even a doorbell camera from a residence across the street. Technology created an unblinking record of events that contradicted any alternative narrative the killers might construct. Detective James Morrison, a 20-year veteran of the department who had grown up in Crest Hill himself, led the investigation. "Usually these cases, there's some complexity, some gray area," he would later tell reporters. "Not here. This was predatory. This was hunting. This was murder in its most straightforward form." The Ridgeway crew made no particular effort to hide. Perhaps they didn't expect consequences, a reasonable assumption given how rarely justice touched their lives. Perhaps they didn't care. Or perhaps, most disturbing of all, they wanted the recognition, the notoriety, the validation of being feared. Kareem was arrested at his home at 7:15 the following morning, still asleep in bed. Trey and Malik were found together at an abandoned property they often used as a hangout. Dwayne was taken into custody at school, let out in handcuffs as classmates recorded on their phones. Jaden was arrested at his grandmother's apartment, her sobs a counterpoint to his stunned silence. None resisted. None seemed particularly surprised. None asked for lawyers immediately, a critical error that allowed initial questioning to produce damaging statements before public defenders were assigned. Within 48 hours, all 5 were charged, Kareem as an adult, the others as juveniles with motions pending to transfer them to adult court. The charges were severe: first-degree murder, conspiracy, weapons violations. The evidence was overwhelming. Security footage, witness statements, the recovered weapon, DNA, and their own incriminating social media activity. The community response was immediate and visceral. A vigil formed outside the laundromat the very night of the murder. Candles, flowers, photographs of Elijah creating a makeshift shrine. By morning, hundreds had gathered. By evening, thousands. His art teacher brought enlarged copies of his sketches, heroes and villains, dreamscapes and nightmares, all rendered with the raw talent that might have carried him to a different future. These images became symbolic, printed on t-shirts and posters, his art living on as his physical presence faded. Elijah's death transcended the tragic routine of neighborhood violence. It touched something deeper, more universal, the senseless destruction of potential, the jarring juxtaposition of creativity against cruelty, the loss not just of what was but what might have been. For 3 days, mourners gathered. Community leaders spoke. Prayers were offered. Promises were made about change, about never forgetting, about transformation. And across town, 5 boys sat in juvenile detention, 4 of them still legally children, facing the slow-moving machinery of a justice system that would determine not just their punishment, but whether they would be treated as youthful offenders deserving rehabilitation or adult criminals deserving retribution. The funeral was held 6 days after the murder, the small community church unable to contain the crowd that spilled onto sidewalks and streets. Marcus spoke, his voice breaking as he described a friendship spanning nearly their entire lives. Teachers shared stories of quiet talent and gentle humor. Neighbors recalled a boy who always carried his sister's backpack, who helped elderly residents with groceries, who drew portraits of neighborhood children and gave them away as gifts. His mother couldn't speak. His father managed only a few sentences about missed futures before emotion overwhelmed words. The most powerful moment came when Maya approached the podium. 15 years old, her face still swollen from days of tears, her hands shaking as she unfolded a paper. "Elijah drew heroes," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "He believed in them. Not the kind with capes or super strength, but the everyday kind. The kind who do right when it's hard, who stand up when it's scary, who help when it's easier to walk away." She paused, looking out at faces blurred by her tears. "My brother was my hero, and now I have to learn how to be my own." The Juvenile Justice Center was not built for high-profile cases. Its fluorescent lights flickered erratically above wooden benches worn smooth by years of anxious waiting. The air conditioning struggled against summer heat, leaving the courtroom uncomfortably warm despite ceiling fans spinning lazily overhead. Yet for 3 weeks in July, this unremarkable room became the focal point for a community's grief, rage, and desperate hope for accountability. The legal proceedings began with jurisdictional hearings, complex legal arguments about whether children could be tried as adults, whether developing brains could form the specific intent required for first-degree murder charges, whether rehabilitation or punishment should be the primary aim of justice. Kareem, at 18, was automatically processed in adult court. For the others, prosecutors pushed aggressively for transfer from juvenile jurisdiction, particularly for Dwayne and Malik, both 16 and both with prior records. For Trey and Jaden, their younger ages, 14 and 13 respectively, made transfer more challenging but not impossible given the severity of the crime. The doctrine of joint enterprise became central to the prosecution strategy, a legal principle allowing all participants in a group crime to be charged equally regardless of their specific actions. Under this doctrine, it didn't matter who physically held the blade. What mattered was shared intent, coordinated action, collective responsibility. Public defenders fought vigorously against this approach, arguing that younger crew members had not anticipated lethal violence, that peer pressure and fear of Kareem had compelled their participation, that developmental neuroscience recognized adolescents' limited capacity for consequential thinking. After 2 weeks of preliminary hearings, Judge Eleanor Ramirez issued her ruling. All 5 would be tried together, in adult court, with sentencing considerations to reflect their respective ages if convicted. The decision sent shockwaves through juvenile justice advocacy groups while drawing grim approval from a community demanding accountability. The trial itself began on a Monday morning in late July. The courtroom was divided like opposing armies. Elijah's family and supporters on one side, relatives of the accused on the other, court officers vigilantly positioned to prevent confrontation. Throughout the proceedings, the defendant's behavior became its own kind of testimony. Kareem maintained a stoic, almost bored expression. Malik and Dwayne alternated between defiance and discomfort. Trey appeared increasingly distressed as evidence mounted. Jaden, the youngest, seemed to physically shrink as the trial progressed, his initial bravado crumbling under the weight of reality. Opening statements established the narratives that would clash throughout the proceedings. Prosecutor Michael Davis presented the state's case with clinical precision. This was not a spontaneous fight, not a momentary lapse of judgment. This was coordinated, planned hunting of another human being, executed with callous disregard for life. But it was the evidence itself that proved most damning. Security footage played on monitors throughout the courtroom, showing the systematic cornering of Elijah, the deliberate blocking of exits, the calculated spreading of soap on the floor to prevent escape. Clinical, undeniable visual evidence that left even some defense attorneys visibly disturbed. Perhaps most devastating was the testimony from Marcus Green, Elijah's best friend and witness to his final moments. Composed yet visibly traumatized, Marcus recounted not just the attack but the context surrounding it. How Elijah had navigated Crest Hill's complex social landscape, how he had avoided conflict, how he had been targeted not for any provocation but simply for being perceived as vulnerable. They watched us for blocks, Marcus testified, his voice steady despite tears, like they were deciding, like they were choosing him specifically. After 8 days of testimony, closing arguments distilled the case to its essence. Prosecutor Davis spoke directly to the central question. Some will say these are just children who made a terrible mistake, but the evidence shows something far darker. It shows calculation, planning, intent, and most disturbingly, it shows a complete absence of remorse afterward. The jury deliberated for just 7 hours before returning with unanimous verdicts. Guilty on all counts for all defendants. As the verdicts were read, reactions rippled through the courtroom. Elijah's mother closed her eyes, tears streaming silently down her face. His father remained rigid, jaw clenched against emotion. Maya leaned against Marcus, both teenagers carrying a weight no child should bear. The sentencing hearing took place on a Friday morning in early September. Summer heat had given way to autumn crispness, leaves beginning their transition from green to gold. Nature's reminder that time continues its forward march regardless of human tragedy. Victim impact statements came first, a procession of lives forever altered by 6 minutes of violence. Denise Carter approached the podium slowly, her hands trembling as she unfolded a paper she ultimately wouldn't need. Looking directly at the defendants for the first time, she spoke with quiet dignity. "I want you to understand what you took," she said. "Not just Elijah's life, though that alone is immeasurable. You took Maya's protector. You took Thomas's fishing partner. You took my son who still called me every day even when his friends teased him about it." Her voice never raised, yet it filled the courtroom completely. "I don't hate you. That surprises me most of all. I should hate you. I want to hate you. But mostly, I feel sorry for you. Because Elijah had everything you didn't. Love, guidance, purpose. And now none of us has him anymore." The defendants received varying sentences reflecting their ages and roles. Kareem Wallace, life imprisonment with possibility of parole after 25 years. Dwayne and Malik, 20 years each. Trey, 15 years. Jaden, 10 years in juvenile detention until 18, then transfer to adult prison to complete his sentence. Numbers that seemed simultaneously excessive and insufficient. How do you measure a life in years? How do you calculate the worth of potential never realized? When the trial ended and the sentences were pronounced, when the media vans departed and the hashtags stopped trending, Crest Hill was left with deeper questions, haunting ones that resisted easy answers. How did it come to this? How did a group of children, boys barely old enough to vote, turn into murderers? What failed them and what failed Elijah Carter? Because let's be honest, something went terribly wrong long before the moment Elijah collapsed in that laundromat, bleeding and scared. Something broke in the system, and these boys, they were the symptoms of that break. Let's start with the basics: education. Each member of the Ridgeway crew had a disrupted education history. Absenteeism, expulsions, alternative schooling, or simply slipping through the cracks. When a child's education collapses, so does their access to opportunity. The classroom is meant to be a place of structure, of hope, of learning not just academics but life skills. But for these boys, it was a revolving door of missed chances and unmet needs. Then there's the question of role models, or rather, the lack of them. For most of the Ridgeway crew, there was no guiding adult presence. No father figure teaching them respect. No steady hand showing them what love looks like. No one to teach accountability or empathy. Instead, they learned from the streets, from older kids who glorified violence and toughness. They looked up to Kareem not because he was kind or wise, but because he seemed powerful in a world where they felt powerless. Dr. Anika Rowe, a criminologist who has worked with at-risk youth, explained it this way. When young people don't have anyone who believes in them, who guides them, they look for belonging wherever they can find it, even if it's toxic, even if it leads to destruction. She added, "The brain of an adolescent is still developing. Decision-making, impulse control, understanding long-term consequences, those areas are still maturing. And when you combine that biological immaturity with trauma, neglect, and violence, you get kids who are emotionally stunted, easily manipulated, and dangerously reactive. But it wasn't just neglect at home. It was poverty, hunger, fear, an environment where carrying a knife was considered safer than walking unarmed, where showing vulnerability was a weakness, where hope was a luxury. In neighborhoods like Crest Hill, survival becomes the goal. Not ambition, not education, just survival. And gangs offer a twisted form of safety, of brotherhood, of identity. That's the hook. That's what lures kids in. Could it have been prevented? Possibly. If the schools had more counselors trained in trauma care. If there were community mentors, sports programs, after-school jobs. If local services had intervened earlier, identified the signs, offered alternatives. If anyone had looked a little deeper, asked a few more questions, made the effort to care. Social worker Denise Harper, who had once worked with one of the boys years before the murder, said something that stuck. People always ask, where were the parents? But I ask, where was everyone else? Teachers, neighbors, local leaders. Why do we treat these kids like ticking time bombs only after they've exploded? The system is reactive. It responds after the damage is done. But real change has to be proactive, preventative, focused not on punishment, but prevention. And what about society's role in this? The media, the government, the economic structures that keep communities like Crest Hill struggling while others thrive? The reality is that youth violence doesn't start with a knife. It starts with despair. It starts when a child looks at their life and sees no future, no reason to hope, no path to follow. We often talk about accountability. And yes, the Ridgeway crew should be held accountable. But so should the systems that raised them, failed them, ignored them. Elijah Carter deserved better. Not just protection on the night he died, but a world where boys like those in the Ridgeway crew never became killers in the first place. Because at the end of the day, the real life sentence wasn't handed out in that courtroom. It's the one Denise Carter carries every day. The one Maya wakes up to every morning. The one Marcus will bear in every memory. And unless something changes, there will be more Elijahs, more Kareems, more headlines. It's time to ask harder questions and find better answers. Hey guys, if you've stayed with us this far, thank you. Stories like Elijah's are never easy to hear, but they're necessary. If this story moved you, made you think, or opened your eyes, please hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep telling stories that matter. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let us know what you think should be done to stop another tragedy like this. Stay safe, stay aware, and we'll see you in the next one.